Hi, this is Andrea Kane, and I'm here to talk to you about HIT 352, Health Information Systems. And we are now on Chapter 4, System Selection. This is the first video for Week 5. We will have 2 videos this week, one on System Selection in Chapter 4, and then one on Chapter 5, which is System Implementation. And the two kind of go hand in glove, because depending on what system you select is how you're going to implement it. Although there are some consistencies that you will always have with every system that you select when you implement it, there are also some twists. So with that in mind, let's move forward and see what we have here. As we have talked about before, we have learning objectives, and these are the ones for this week in the chapter of the book that we're working on. And I'll, of course, move forward in the screen, but wanted to remind you we still are working on course objectives 8.2.3.4, and those equate to learning objectives 9.2.1 through 9.2.7, 9.3.1 through 9.3.3, and 9.4.1 through 9.4.7 in case you're concerned. All right, so let's dive in. System selection. What is system selection? It is determining which information system will be purchased. That's pretty much it. That's the process. You got to go through, when you identify that you need a system, a new system or a different system or an additional system, then you have a process to go through. How do you do that? How do you know which one to choose? Which one's better? How do you evaluate these? How do you open it up to vendors so that they know that you're interested in purchasing a system? Well, we will get to all of that because let me tell you, vendors will always be knocking on your door as a healthcare organization or healthcare provider or healthcare facility, that if they don't have your business, they want your business. It's a very aggressive world out there, aggressive and competitive EHR, information system world. Okay, what is a system development life cycle? This is a model that was developed to be used to represent the process of developing or purchasing an information system. Back in the day, early on, many healthcare organizations thought that they had an IT department and they were really good and they could develop their own information systems, and many did. They created what were called homegrown systems, and some of them worked quite well, and others, let's just say, they had left a lot to be desired. I've worked with both in the past, and if you have an incredible team, that's certainly something that an organization can consider. But in this day and age of interoperability and all that comes with the requirements of that, almost everyone, I would say like 97% of the time or greater, you're going to be talking about purchasing an information system or expanding your information system or adding to it with a adding onto your information system perhaps with another information system, or upgrading it with a newer platform or newer software, or switching from one information system that is current like Cerner to another one like Epic, because those are really the two big players in town. There are other ones, and there are health systems that have used other ones, but pretty much most of the major medical centers and health systems have come down to one of those two. Even the government, I think, has selected Cerner for some of its stuff. So moving on, what are the stages, the life cycle stages with system development? Planning and analysis, design, implementation, and then support and evaluation. Those are the 4. So make sure, this is an important slide, make sure that you know this. And not just for the quiz on this chapter, but make sure you know this, because hint, hint, you will probably be asked it on the RHIT exam. What is strategic planning as it relates to information systems. It is the process of identifying and assigning priorities to the application of information technology that will assist an organization in executing its business plans and achieving its strategic goals and objectives. Okay, so strategic planning, every organization does this. They have usually a long-term plan that may be up to 5 years out, and they may have a shorter one that may be 2 to 3 years out that they work on that helps them build toward that 5-year plan. That strategic plan looks at the organization as a whole, every aspect of the organization. In that same vein, with information systems, knowing that they become outdated, obsolete, companies get bought out, equipment ages out, technology changes and advances. You have to look at information systems as something that's very critical to the organization, because it is. The information cannot survive without a robust information system. And that is where there needs to be strategic planning, specifically about information systems. So your Chief Information Officer, your CIO, is heavily involved in this with senior leadership, going through and looking at the information technology that it currently has and assessing when is that going to run out. So if we go back here, now this is life stages, this is the evaluation part in the strategic planning. You're evaluating what it is, how long it's going to last, and that sort of thing. And then you're starting with planning and analysis. So if you know, okay, our system was slated to last 7 years and we're in year 5, you know that you're going to need to start getting aggressive about planning and analysis if you've only got 7 years for that system and already your vendor is saying, we're gonna discontinue that platform and we're gonna move all of our customers on. So either you need to move on and spend millions of dollars with us, or you need to find a new one, which of course is even more millions of dollars. So an organization, because these systems can be 20, 30, 50, $75 million projects, this is not something you want to decide overnight. And this is something you have to keep in mind and keep planning for. So you have to have in mind, okay, this is what we have now. Here's how long we estimate it's going to last. Here's what we estimate the costs are going to be when it comes time to reevaluate. And here's what our needs are going to be, or what we think the technology is going to provide for us. I realize that's a very long answer, but realistically, it's really important to understand the foundations behind this. IT decisions cannot happen overnight. It can take years. I have seen where IT system implementations have been rushed in a less than 6-month time period, and what the fallout from that can be. I have seen organizations that have taken 3 years to implement, and again, they've had issues. I've seen other organizations take 12 months to 18 to 24 months and do a fabulous job. It really just depends. It depends on your organization, your resources, the commitment of senior leadership and providers and everyone buying in and being a part of this. It's not something that happens on a dime. Because again, you're talking major capital money that has to go into this. So okay, I kind of beat that horse to death. Sorry about that. Planning, you have to plan. You have to lay out, okay, here are what our needs are, and make sure you understand that. Organizing the project. Who's going to make the final decision, and how are they going to make it? What are they going to be making it based on? Odds are you're going to have all the way up to the board of the organization making this decision. because of how much money it's involving and how much it's going to impact the organization, the providers, the patients, all of this. So you have to make sure you have all of the details, all of the facts, and you're able to take those to all the major stakeholders and get buy-in. You need to define the scope of the project. Are we replacing one part of the system? Excuse me. For instance, let's go back to talking about a specific clinic. Let's talk dialysis because that's a really easy one. Let's say that your current IT system is hospital-based and you've been using it in your dialysis unit. And you're expanding your dialysis unit because you have a huge community need and you're not able to serve all of the patients that need to be served. So you're going to expand your dialysis unit. At the same time, you recognize that you need to be capturing more data, different data, additional data, and you want to move from taking manual vital signs and manually entering information to being hooked up to your machines or being able to capture that through hotspots or things like that and make it more of an electronic system. So you decide that maybe the scope of your project, this project, is you're going to look at software for a dialysis EHR that can interface with your hospital EHR. So you're defining the scope of the project. It is somewhat different to replace a dialysis EHR versus a whole health system organizational-wide EHR versus a health system that has 30 hospitals and hundreds of clinics, provider clinics across multiple states. They're all different. You've got to define the scope of that project. You may go through the same steps, so to speak, but it's going to be very different, and that scope is going to be different. The cost is going to be different. The time frames are going to be different. The number of people involved, how it's going to impact productivity, and all of that. It's all different. So you've got to define it. And then systems analysis. Whoops, I went too far here. Systems analysis. You need to analyze and see what is out there. What is it that your current system can do or can't do, or that you want it to do in the future. I can't emphasize enough the importance of planning. That is just so critical, and it's got to be comprehensive. It involves getting everyone from the front line, the people that are doing the task, talking to them about what's working well, what's not working well, what's a frustration, where do they feel like they're wasting time, where do they wish they had technology, or technology to do what, or how is it being captured. For instance, with coders, lack of planning. Somebody who doesn't know coding might think that a coder needs a single screen, a single monitor. I can tell you from coding, it is tremendously helpful to have dual screens, and not just small screens or normal size screens, but oversized screens so that you can see images, and you can have your coding software open, you can have the EHR open, and you can be moving between those two seamlessly. So lack of planning can have a tremendous impact. Again, not going to your providers and helping them see the need for this, and helping them identify what changes they need in their workflow and how is that going to impact them. So you need to conduct a feasibility study. Set the budget. What is the budget? If you have a budget for a $10 million project and yet what you're trying to buy is $50 million, that's not going to work. You're going to have to set the budget, and you're going to have to figure out what's going to live within that budget. And if you can't live within that budget, can you get additional funds? If you can't, what's going to have to get cut? Who's going to have to give it up? And what are they going to have to give up? I hate to say it, but there's some tough decisions that come down to it. You may decide that some of the work has to be done in-house by your IT people, such as testing. rather than having the IT company do it. The IT company may be very used to it and they may have the people to do it, but if that costs you more money than what's in your budget and you still want to be able to have the functionality that you have, you may find that you're going to have to find people within your own organization to do some of the hourly work, so to speak, of making sure everything is where it needs to be. Setting goals and objectives. How will you know if this is a successful project? How will you know if this is going to help you with your strategic plan as an organization? How do you know it's going to improve efficiency? How do you know that it is going to decrease risk for the organization? Make sure you have clear goals and objectives. Identifying the project manager and team. Making sure you have the right project manager can make or break you. You have to have somebody who has the right experience, the right qualities and strengths to make this happen. You have to make sure that they're able to do this project, and they have to have a team. This is not a one and done type of deal. This is not where you have one person who's the project manager and it's on their shoulders to make this happen. Oh no. And not just one team, but multiple teams. You've got to be able to identify those and make it clear, how is this going to work? Again, obtaining buy-in from management, from providers, from users, from anyone who is a stakeholder in this process. You've got to get them involved and let them be a part of this if you want adoption and success. There needs to be a feasibility study done. Don't just look at one system because you've met with the vendor and the vendor salesperson has become a buddy or a friend or somebody that you really like. No, you need to look at multiple systems. You need to do a feasibility study on them and see which one meets your objectives. And what benefits are you going to have? What issues are you going to have? What is included in what you're trying to do? What are the short-term issues you're going to run into? What are the long-term issues you're going to run into? And what are the alternatives if you don't do this? Let's say you think you need a new system, but you're not sure. What's the alternative? What's the worst that's going to happen if you don't get a new system now? If you put it off 2 years? Or if you get a system that has far fewer bells and whistles? Or is more of a vanilla system than a best of breed system? What happens if you decide you don't want to buy the system yourself, but you want to see if a nearby organization will sell you their services and their system so that they will manage it for you, and essentially you outsource your IT to them? You've got to talk through all of the options and the feasibility to make sure, should your facility proceed, should they wait, or do they not need this really at all? That this would be a luxury, not a necessity. Setting the budget. Most of us don't set the budget. We work for people who set the budget. And you know what? There's a lot of good to not be the person that sets the budget. That's a tremendous responsibility, and typically that does not sit on one single person's shoulder, thankfully. The CFO, I would say the Chief Financial Officer, is heavily involved with setting the budget. But even he or she has to go out and gather information and be able to identify all of what's happening and what will happen to know what is the budget. You have to know selection and implementation expenses, cost of maintaining the system, the software, upgrading infrastructure, hardware, training, renovations, project management. And on top of all that, you have to know what your reimbursement is going to be down the line. What is your profit margin going to be down the line? I can tell you for a fact, and I'm sure if you asked any CFO at any healthcare organization in the United States who thought last fall, let's say their fiscal year started September 1st or even January 1st, that they thought they wouldn't be able to afford all that they had before COVID hit. I don't think there was any CFO who could have possibly predicted COVID and or its financial impact on individual organizations and how they had to allocate money. And this is a great example. When you set the budget, you set it based on what you know, based on historical data as well as prospective data. And so when an organization sets this budget, this is what they anticipate they're going to be able to do with the funds that they have or that they expect to come in. If something changes, this may also have to change. So you have to be really careful that when you set the budget, you understand that yes, that's the budget, and you definitely want to hang in there and meet that budget. But the project may have to change if something significantly changes with the budget, whether you go over, under, or you have a COVID situation. You need to know consultant expenses and travel expenses. Because guess what? Those two add up very quickly. Now, consultant expenses and travel expenses, those can be somewhat minimized by making sure you're well prepared when you have a consultant that you're going to work with to keep their time to a minimum. And also, in this COVID environment we're in, many are not traveling. They're doing their consulting through video, through Zoom. And that cuts down on travel expenses tremendously. And so having gone through this, there may be organizations in the future that will not budget for consultant travel expenses until a certain point in the project because it can be done over Zoom and that would save them money. Sorry, I had to keep stopping to get a drink. My voice is going. Goals and objectives. They need to be based on business goals. The SMART methodology is always recommended, and if you're not familiar with SMART methodology, please take some time to learn about that because it will come back to you in the spring when we get to your quality management class. I teach that in the spring, and you will need to know this, and you will probably need to do it a couple of times. Hint, hint. Okay, project management. Formal set of principles, procedures that help control the activities associated with implementing an unusually large undertaking to achieve a specific goal. Lots of words in there to basically say you're responsible. You're responsible. Project management is being responsible to make it happen. Project team. They represent multiple disciplines working on the project. You need someone from almost every discipline to be involved on the project. You need that representation. You need that feedback. No one person or even a group of 5 people can possibly know all the disciplines and what they need and how to make it successful for them. So the more people you get involved from the very front lines up, the better off you are. And then it defines project manager, it talks about project manager. That's the person who's responsible for the project's management and making sure that the project team moves ahead and does what it's supposed to do. Obtaining buy-in. You have to have buy-in or your project will fail. I have worked at organizations that have failed to do this, and I cannot tell you how they could have saved themselves so much time, effort, anguish, sabotage, all sorts of other things had they gotten buy-in in the planning and analysis phase. If you wait to talk to providers at the point where you're getting ready to implement training, you can write it off. It's not going to work. These are people who use the system every day, and they're using it to care for their patients. You've got to get their buy-in. frontline people, if you're looking at a system that involves release of information, whoever is dealing with release of information on the front line, interacting with patients, interacting with insurance companies, interacting with lawyers, that person needs to be involved. And you need to make sure that they're understanding why you're doing what you're doing. If you are implementing a new documentation system in your emergency department, your staff and your providers need to understand why. Why are you replacing what they currently have? And what makes this better? What's in it for them? So make sure that you do that. And it can't just be management support. Now, you definitely need management support, and typically that's the easiest to get, but you've got to get frontline support and stakeholder support, which means those providers, and you have to do a lot of communication. A lot of communication. You can't ever do too much communication. Helping them see what you're seeing and understand what you're understanding. Help them see the data behind what you're doing, or the science behind it, or what has worked for other organizations and why you think it would work well for your organization. And what is their role going to be? How are you going to include them so that they can be a part of all this and that they can share their concerns? Change management. Anytime you have a system selection process, you need to deal with change management. And that is the formal process of introducing change, getting it adopted, and diffusing it throughout the healthcare facility. We live in a time of constant change, and that can be very stressful. It can also cause fear, because as technology advances, sometimes it replaces tasks that were done manually by individuals, and people fear, my job is going away. A good example of this was transcription about 10 years ago. Transcription shifted from back end into speech recognition, but it moved away from a lot of the back end transcription and editing and voice recognition editing to front end, where the provider themselves would then take care of the editing. An example of this was radiology. Used to be a radiologist, and this is back in the day, would dictate the radiology report. The transcriptionist would transcribe it. The radiologist would go back in it, review it, see if it may make any changes he or she wanted to make, sign it off, authenticate it, and off it would go. Then it turned into the radiologist would dictate the report. It would go through voice recognition on the back end. The transcriptionist would edit it. It would go back to the radiologist for she or he to review it, make whatever final changes they wanted to it, authenticate it, sign it, and off it went. Now, it is very, very common. It's almost across the board. Now it's all front-end voice recognition, where the radiologist is dictating the report and it's pulling up words on the screen as he or she is doing that. And they make the edits as they go. And then they authenticate it, sign it, and off it goes. There's no transcriptionist involved in it. Well, there's a lot of fear with that. If you're introducing technology that's going to take away work from somebody, what are you doing to help them see that they are still valued, valuable, and that there's a place for them in the organization? I worked in the healthcare organization where I was at allowed us to shift our transcriptionist to an organization that was still doing front-end back-end voice recognition and traditional transcription. They were a sister hospital in our health system. So my transcriptionists, 7 out of 10 of them decided that that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to stay in transcription, and so they moved to being employed. They were all at home at the time, and they just changed so that they worked for the sister hospital. They still transcribe at home, still use the same equipment. It's just that they were transcribing for the sister hospital. And the sister hospital actually took on any of our work that was still back in voice recognition. So they were still interacting with our providers, and they were still doing that. The 3 that decided not to do that, we found places for them in our long-term care facilities where they could switch to working as a medical records technician in these long-term care facilities where they did everything except coding. So they were managing the records, they were interacting with nursing staff, with the providers, they were doing record storage and retrieval, they were doing release of information. It gave them a way that they could still be involved and utilize some of their skills, but in a different way. So you need to make sure that when you're doing this, that you use change management and that you think ahead, how is this going to affect people, and how can we develop ways to utilize people or to make sure that they're placed in such a way that they are going to continue to be successful, even if they can't keep doing what they did before, how they did it before. And you need to update them on the status as this moves along so that they know, okay, this is the time frame we expect this change to happen. Is it 6 months from now? Is it 6 weeks from now? So that there's not a surprise there, a bad surprise. Organization of the project. Looking at the project, you have to have specific objectives, a series of activities, define start and stop dates, deliverables. And most all of this is usually Excel spreadsheet kind of stuff. Project team, the membership can vary and it needs to vary. You need to discuss the project itself and any issues related to it. HIM folks are frequently on the team. They realize that we're used to dealing with clinical information, patient information, reimbursement information across the board, and they want us to be there because we're able to remind them about all of these different aspects. There is an Information Systems Project Steering Committee usually. It involves the Chief Information Officer. That CIO is heavily involved with all of this. There's often a user task force, and the vendor plays a role, and then you have consultants that'll come in and work with you in specific areas about specific topics. The project manager is responsible for making sure you're staying on budget, that resources are allocated and utilized as they need to be, that negotiations are taking place, although most organizations use the CIO to deal with negotiations. But if there are negotiations that need to be made between specialties or areas or units or that type of thing, the project manager is more likely to be involved in those. And then schedule. The project manager is responsible for making sure it stays on schedule. You define the scope of the project. Make sure you have a project definition. What is the purpose behind this project? How is it linked to the organization's business strategy? What are the goals and the scope of the project? And if the scope starts to creep, which means expand, sort of hyperplasia, if you're thinking in medical terminology, it starts to grow. How do you handle that? Does it need to grow? Or is this, gee, I wish it would grow because I need this extra piece or part that's not really in the budget, but we really need it, or we need this interface and we didn't originally anticipate it, but that's another $20,000, and you have to watch out for that. Because it's too easy to blink and all of a sudden you've spent $2 or $3 more million than what is in your budget, or you committed to it. Project plan. There are tasks to be performed. Some of the components include feasibility study, looking at your resources, design, hardware and software procurement, making sure you get all your hardware in and placed in time. That's a critical thing to go live. Sometimes people cut it too short and you have a go live and you don't have a PC that you need, or you don't have both screens, you have one. Or, you know, back in the day, it was you didn't have your barcode reader, or you didn't have your voice recognition software in place. So there's all these things you have to make sure are happening, that it's ordered in advance, that it arrives when it needs to, that you have enough people that can go out and install it if it has to be physically installed. Transition, how is that going to happen? What are you doing to make that a smooth transition? When are you going to flip the switch, so to speak? And what's going to happen in the couple of hours up to that flip the switch, and what's going to happen in the couple of hours after you flip the switch. For instance, you have to draw a line in the sand and say, we're going to start using the new system at this time on this day. So up until then, are you charting in the old system? When do you stop charting in the old system and start charting in the new system? When do you stop and say, we're going to take a snapshot of the old system and convert it into the new system, and anything after that won't be converted and uploaded until this date and time? There's all sorts of things that you have to take into consider in that transition and that implementation that actually happen. And the implementation is not a 1 hour period or even a 1 day period or even a 1 week period. It can be a whole month. It can be the 2 weeks that lead up to it, and the 2 weeks that are immediately after it is your implementation period, where you are doing just an enormous amount to have that transition happen. And then, of course, support and evaluation. Some project management tools that you need to be familiar with include a Gantt chart, and if you're not sure what a Gantt chart is, please look it up. Again, you will become familiar with a Gantt chart when we get to quality management in the spring. So keep in mind, if you don't know it now, you will know it later. Project evaluation and review technique chart, that's another one you can look up and take a look at. Project plan, trouble tickets, status reports. You'll be collecting, organizing, and evaluating data on the healthcare facility and the information it needs. How do you know what needs to be converted from the old system to the new system, and where's that going to go, and how's that going to work? Functional requirements. You got to know what those are going to be too. Internal scanning, external scanning, and then tools to gather data. Questionnaires, interviews, observations, flowcharts. You have all this that has to be done of what is it today, and what is it going to be at Go Live, and what is it going to be after Go Live? What are those differences? What is it going to look like? And how is that going to happen? And why? Build versus buy versus cloud computing. Okay, you can build it yourself, you can buy it, or you can say, hey, we don't want to build or buy, we just want to cloud compute. And I believe that cloud computing, where did we talk about that? I'm trying to go back and see. But I believe that you had to do a PowerPoint back in week 2 about cloud computing. What is it? How does it work? And all of that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. What are some advantages of cloud computing? You can read those, and again, hopefully you're already familiar with those from what we did in that prior assignment. Here are some disadvantages. Again, you probably know those from your assignment. If you build, these are some things you need to keep in mind. Again, build is pretty rare these days. It's very labor intensive, very expensive, and there's no guarantee that you'll come out of it with a system that can be maintained long term. Buy tends to be the most common choice, although cloud computing is not far behind it. Things you have to remember about buying is it may not completely meet your needs. Most places get a vanilla system and they don't pay for a whole lot of enhancements because it gets expensive every time you do an upgrade, because you have to upgrade each one of those enhancements, and it takes longer, more expensive, you have more chances for glitches and problems and breakdowns and all sorts of other things. When you buy, oftentimes your vendor will say, well, we'll make you a beta site or an alpha site. Let's just say, having been there, there are advantages and disadvantages. I'm going to start with a beta site. When you're a beta site, you basically get the product and they think it's fairly well mature. There might be a handful of glitches or a handful of issues that, and you might identify 1, 2, 3, or 4, not very many, but for the most part it pretty well works, and it works fairly well. So being a beta site, beta test site, it's not a bad thing. It can cut off some costs for you and give you an idea of what's going to be in the general release down the road, 6 months or so. An alpha site, on the other hand, basically agrees to take on a system that is just barely built and it has minimal testing. So you can pretty much expect you're going to have plenty of trouble. If you have the patience of a saint, an alpha site might be what you choose. If you don't have the patience of a saint, and not just you, but everybody at your organization, a beta site would probably be a better choice. And if you want something that's guaranteed to work, don't be an alpha or a beta site. Now, another cool thing about being a beta site or even an alpha site is you get to recommend to the developer things, enhancements that they might be able to put in the final product, especially if you're an alpha site. That is one of the advantages to being an alpha site, is you can say, you know what, it would really be more efficient if we had this functionality. And sometimes they can write that in before it goes to the beta site. So there are some advantages there. You just have to be really, really patient. Integrated versus interfaced. This is another one. You've heard me say best of breed. Best of breed means you take several different systems and each one is the best of its kind and you interface them together. So that, let's say you have an EHR system for a hospital, and that is one system. Then you have best of breed for a surgical system. Then you have a best of breed for an HIM system. And they're all interfaced together so that they can communicate and share information and be updated. They are all very expensive, but they have these interfaces in between. And for the most part, interfaces work, but they can go down and they can fail and they can have glitches. The other option is what unfortunately has become more popular over the last 5 to 7 years, maybe 10 years even, and that is an integrated system. Those are your Cerners, your Epics, those types of systems that they're essentially a whole organization-wide system. They don't have interfaces. The data is all integrated, but they are not the best of breed. They do not have the specificity and the functionality that you would get with a best of breed system. And I experienced this in one of my organizations. They had an HIM system that was truly best of breed. The functionality, the reporting, the ease of using the system, it was way up there. Everybody loved it. Everyone in the department loved the system. And from a management leadership perspective, I loved it because I could go in and run reports at the drop of a hat. They were well made. I could even create my own reports, and it was very easy, very customer friendly to do. If I had any issues, I could just call the company and they would get on with me or get on with the staff member. It was everything I could have hoped for in an HIM system. It was best of breed. But the organization that I worked at was part of a large health system. And even though they weren't owned by the health system, they were managed by it. And they chose to outsource their IT to the big health system, and the big health system had Cerner. And they decided to come in and remove all of our best of breed systems and replace them with an integrated system, which happened to be Cerner. We lost a lot of our functionality. Now, we didn't have to worry about interfaces anymore, but we lost that functionality. So there are pros and cons to both. I've worked with both. An integrated system, like I said, you don't have to worry about interface issues. But on the other hand, you do lose functionality. System selection steps, you request information, RFI. That's the first step, an RFI, request for information. Basically, you're putting it out there to see what vendors and systems are out there. What's out there, what's available, what are the possibilities. The next thing you do is you develop your request for proposal, RFP. And that is where you say, here's what we want. We have defined what our needs are, and this is what we need a system to be able to do. Here is all of what we are going to require from a vendor and a system. And then you identify, say, 6 vendors that could potentially, 6 or 8 vendors that could potentially meet this, and you send them the same request for proposal. And you give them a deadline that they have to get their answer to your RFP back to you by. And once you receive that request for proposal, then you go through it to identify which vendors truly can meet all of your criteria, or enough of your criteria that you will evaluate their product and bring them in to do some vendor displays and presentations. And then you do that evaluation. I mean, you've evaluated the proposal, but then you bring in the vendors, you bring in the systems, and you actually look at what could this do and what could be met, what wouldn't be met, what really would it involve, and all of that. And then you have the selection process where you go through and you rate the different vendors. And I've been through all of this. So by the way, this is old hat. And this is not just, this process, the system selection process, is not just for systems. This is the same process you go through if you are looking for a scanning vendor, a record storage and retrieval vendor, a contract coding vendor, an auditing vendor for coding and coding accuracy, coding quality evaluations and things like that. If you used an outsourced transcription service, this is the same selection process you would go through for all of those. And then the last part is the contract negotiation. And typically HIM is not involved in the contract negotiation unless you are talking about something that's specific to HIM, like contract release of information services or contract coding. Then you're involved in that negotiation. Otherwise, that all takes place with the CIO and the CFO and whatever lawyer is working, general counsel that works for the organization. They take care of all that contract negotiation. And then there's, oh, sorry, I kind of went through those, didn't I? But RFI, RFP, and I want to say that those are in the back of your book. Am I correct on that? Yes. In the back of your book, on page 285, Appendix A is an RFI and an RFP template. And I would encourage you to go out and look at some RFIs and look at some RFPs just so that you see and understand kind of a couple of examples. Excuse me. You may have a letter of introduction. You may have information for potential vendors, description of systems. You know, if they come on site, and this is bidders conference, but pretty much if they come on site, you want them to go over their system, talk about formats, instructions, give you examples, provide profiles of their company and their products. Are there any testing requirements, some selection criteria, training requirements? You're looking for all those elements. You definitely want to have on-site and online demonstrations. Now, in this COVID environment, it's pretty much all online demonstrations. But, and that's not a bad thing either. That can save money. But it does help to have on-site demonstrations. Site visits. This is often done. When I worked for an organization in Florida, they were looking to change contract release of information vendors, ROI vendors. And one company that was based in California flew us out to LA, myself and the director of the department at the time. And we were in LA and we went to see several of their sites that they were contracted to, as well as their main corporate site, to understand kind of how they were processing things. Now, that was back in the day. I have also done site visits as recently as 2015. At that point, I was working on a project that involved a concept of a freestanding ED. And so we went and toured some freestanding EDs and met with their staff and providers, walked through their settings and that type of thing. And then, of course, you review the RFP, you tear it apart, you ask questions, you clarify information, you really try and pin your vendors down, and definitely do reference checks. Do reference checks. If they give you a list of 5 facilities that utilize their services or their products or what have you, call them, speak to the people that they have listed, ask them, what do you like about this? What do you not like about this? What do you wish was different? What kind of challenges have you experienced? Have you had any delays? Has this vendor been reliable? Have they ever gone back on their word? Have they ever failed you? What have they done to make it right? All those types of things. How have you experienced, what kind of documentation does the vendor provide to you, and how current is it? How complete is it? What kind of training do they provide? What kind of equipment have they demanded? Were there any surprises when you selected their system and implemented it? Ask all these questions. Do those reference checks. And then you'll want to quantify everything and weigh it all out. A lot of people use a point system or a weighted decision matrix to make their decision. And then you develop a contract team who's going to actually do the contract negotiation. And you want to set up a win-win situation. You don't want to take advantage of your vendor. You want to make sure that the contract benefits both of you. You don't want something in there that's going to harm either one of you, because this needs to be a positive relationship. You're working together to improve your situation. And so if you go into it with a competitive or an antagonistic, that you're going to get them to come down by this amount of money, or you're going to get them to give you services that you think you deserve, that should be included, be really careful, because that can get you into a really negative relationship that can come back to haunt. That has not happened to me, but I have heard about that from other HIM folks who were involved in something like that. So just saying. You need to make sure that there's clauses in there about software licensing, delivery dates, warranties and guarantees, responsibilities of each party, the state whose laws govern the contract. The smartest organizations I have worked for have always made sure that their state is the one whose laws govern the contract. I'll give you an example. I worked in North Carolina. The organization that I worked for, every contract, every single contract had to be under North Carolina state laws. And that is just smart business practice, to keep it under your state where you're at. Cost definitely needs to be in that contract. Milestones for payment. If you're not sure what force majeure is, look it up. Software and escrow, cancellation of the contract. What happens if you have to cancel the contract? What happens if you run into another COVID situation, your organization can't fulfill their end of the contract, you're going to have to cancel it. What version of software is going to be installed? What are any penalties in the contract if something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to happen or when it's supposed to happen? How do you know it's been accepted? What kind of acceptance testing is there? What about maintenance and updates? What about training? What about documentation? So you have all of that. Lots there. Lots more than probably what we thought when we started. All right, that is Chapter 4, System Selection for Week 5. I'll be back shortly and we will talk about system implementation in Chapter 5 for Week 5.